Dylan Mallas. How you doing?
Philip Melder. How you doing?
Great, man.
I'm good. How are you?
I'm great. How's the beginning of the quiz year for you guys?
So far, so good. I'm working hard. Things are going well.
All right, so tell the quiz community a little bit about yourself for those that don't know you.
All right. So I have been involved in quizzing since I was 8. So 2001. 2001? Yeah, that sounds right. And I quizzed for 10 years, and I'm going into my 9th year of coaching, I think. So roughly 20 years or so.
Wow.
Yeah, it's a long time.
It's awesome.
But good long time. I really enjoy it. I have a lot of passion for quizzing. I spend like a lot of my free time like just figuring out things for my team and being super nerdy and like looking at old quizzing statistics. Yeah, I love quizzing. I think this is how many times have I done Psalms now? 3rd time through with Psalms.
We did it in 2012.
2012 and also 2003. I quizzed it as a junior.
You quizzed it.
Yeah, and then that was my 2nd year of coaching in 2013.
You know what's crazy is my first year quizzing was 2003 Psalms.
Yeah.
And I was an intermediate. There you go. So I remember the first time we met, y'all came down to the Urbana Church in Illinois, and I knew y'all didn't really know anybody, and I was like, I just felt like I needed to introduce myself, and we just hit it off because we have a lot in common with quizzing. Like, we both are super quiz nerds. We love statistics. We love coaching. Quizzing's a huge part of our lives. And
I mean, I think I was the better quizzer.
Oh, that hurt. But it's true. Very true. So, but it is both, obviously, like a big part of our lives, and we love it. And we really share that. And yeah, there's few people that I can nerd out about quizzing with more than you. Maybe none.
Yep.
Probably not.
Probably not anybody. Maybe Chad Nash.
Yeah, Chad. Yeah, we can talk. Chad loves the stats too. But really glad that we hit it off a couple years ago, and we've been getting to quiz against each other a little bit. Wisconsin and Illinois are close, so we've gotten to go to a lot of tournaments and love your kids. You love my kids, and it's nice that our kids get to hang out and make friends and everything. So today, really excited. We're doing our 2nd question breakdown. And you are awesome at breaking down questions, awesome at teaching questions, and I've seen you in action some. Also, you're a fantastic contester. There's like 3 or 4 coaches that when they go down for a contest, especially if like we're against them, I'm just convinced that it's going to get granted, and you're one of the.
I mean, the actual percentage is not that high, but
I've seen you work your magic. I have seen it. You, Sister Kim, Darren Venus, are definitely in the top 4. There may be one I'm missing, but so yeah, I asked you to prep some direct and multiple part questions for us to just step through, explain interruption points, explain like the question structure, explain how to properly answer, and let's just kind of dive in. So what you got for us?
All right. So let's get this going. The way I kind of have everything split up to break down questions, I have it split up by point value. So we're going to have like 10-point questions, 20-point questions, and 30-point questions. And then I have it broken down even further into 10-point directs and 10-point, well, multiples, but 2 parts in the 10s. And then the same way for 20s and 30s.
Okay.
And you can feel free to pipe in and give your own opinion.
Oh, I
know
will.
You will. So,
so real quick. So all these questions are Brother Faubert's questions from state finals.
They're from the state finals pack from last year.
Okay.
So that's where all the questions came from. I figured that would be the best way to go as people are preparing themselves throughout the season for things like state and for nationals. So.
I do agree. I think Brother Faubert's are the toughest to prep for because we don't really have anything beforehand. With Extrav, we have the opportunity to purchase the prep set, which if you don't get that, please, if you're going to Extravaganza, anyone listening, please get the prep set because it can really help. And then obviously state tournaments, you can buy a lot of practice questions, but for Brother Faubert, the first time you hear his questions for the year is at state. And so all we have to look at is his previous years, and just kind of get to know him as a question writer a little bit, right?
Right, and with it being Psalms, obviously there's going to be some differences between looking at last year's questions on doctrine, which are a variety of writers, whereas when we're looking specifically this year, studying the Psalms of David, the types of questions that will lend themselves to this year's material may be slightly different than what you would see in other years.
Yep. So maybe we can talk about that as from question to question, like maybe how it would be in Psalms. We'll see.
Yep. So just a little bit about how I kind of work with my team as we're getting ready for particularly tournaments like Extravaganza and moving towards getting ready for state and for nationals. I tend to focus really specifically one type of question at a time. We'll go through a little more than I would typically do in a practice. I would do like 10-point direct questions would be our entire practice for that week or for that practice session. And really focus heavily on that and get a lot of that work in. I'll often kind of pose it as a question for my kids where we'll just do a bunch of that type of question in a row without me saying anything to the kids, and then I'll ask them what they noticed about them. And we'll have a conversation about it, or we'll write things down. That helps kind of get the conversation rolling. And so it's not just me feeding them information, but having them do a little bit of digging themselves.
Right. I think it's really important. I think that's something that we just kind of fell into naturally to doing is constant discussion almost after every question sometimes, and talking about, okay, like what were you thinking when you hit there? Like what was going through your mind? What was your process? And sometimes it takes a while for a quizzer to get used to explaining what was going through their head and to kind of sort everything out. But it's really important to be able to talk through that stuff and for them to get to a point where they can explain where their thought process was going while they were answering.
Exactly. So I guess we'll dive in. So starting with 10-point direct questions, I picked literally the first question that was in the prep set, or in the state final set rather. And so the question is, in the days of Noah, what waited? This is a very typical kind of question that you'll get. And it's short. One thing my kids would notice is that we don't have a reference in the question, right? So that's something you need to be aware of. And I think just from what I've noticed in the 10s, more than any other writer, Brother Faubert tends to not use a reference because we want our kids to know what the scripture says, not just based on here's this reference so you can quote it verbatim. It's wonderful to be able to do that, but that is a skill to be able to pull information based purely upon things like unique phrases and unique words. So that in this case, the way the question is worded, you have that introductory phrase of in the days of Noah. And that's kind of your key information to let you know where the verse is in our material. So and then when we go into the question itself, because of the way the sentence is structured, the way that you read it is going to give you a little bit of a hint as a quizzer as to where the question is going. And I can hear a quizmaster in my head, like in the days of Noah, and that the inflection of your voice tends to give you some hints as a quizzer as to where the question is going to go. And so in this case, some quizzers would go to the long suffering of God did what? And typically I find that in 10-point questions that we've kind of gone away from asking those like did what questions. Some people still will when they'll write them, but we tend to like identify the verb, weighted being the verb, right? And then asking a question about like that verb then. So in this case, that's the way this question is working. And our answer then is the long suffering of God. It's a very straightforward question. It's one that you can hit pretty aggressively, in my opinion. I'm assuming you agree with me.
No, I do. I will say, like, when it comes to choosing between what weighted and the long suffering of God did what, usually I'm just kind of like, okay, which one's the better answer? Like, which one's the more interesting answer that the question writer would want you to pay attention to? Weighted,
Yeah.
or the long suffering of God? You know, I think it's that's kind
some of it is just a stylistic choice too.
Yeah.
And I've just observed that over the last few years, and it's probably not even a conscious decision, but I've noticed in particularly Brother Faubert's writing and in Chad Nash's writing that they tend to go more for identifying the verb and asking a question about the verb, as opposed to just having the verb be the question.
Right. I would agree with you.
And again, that's just a stylistic choice. Other than that, I think this one's pretty straightforward. But you'll get very similar sentence structure to this. It could be, some other form of time. So our identifier here is some form of time. It could be in the beginning, whatever. Who created the heavens and the earth, or whatever the verse is that you might be going with. That actually isn't a half bad question that I came up with on the spot. But something like that, where you've got that time identifier, which also serves as your key information to hone in on which verse it is, and then you have a question about the verb. So it's a pretty common question style.
Well, and it's also flipped, right? The verse says, "The long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah." So I always kind of call these like a Yoda question. I know it's super nerdy, like, but where they flip Yoda speak. They flipped it around, and so I usually say, okay, you have this key information. What phrase, like what thought does that information come out of? Because usually the question is going to be in that thought or that phrase, and the phrase is the long suffering of God waited in the days of Noah, and so come up with a question with a good answer out of the rest of that thought or that phrase. So, all right,
moving on. This is another very straightforward kind of question type. Who dwelleth in Zion? Our information here we want to get to, that word dwelleth. In some years that's going to be a one-time word, or unique enough that you can create a question from there. Without having the charting material in front of me from last year, I couldn't tell you if it's a unique word or not.
Let me I think I may still have, so I have it. So let's look up dwell. So dwell is many places. Dwelleth is, it's like a 6-time word. So it's definitely not.
Now, so the thing I would go to then is you need to pay attention to as well, are the other instances not necessarily a who?
Yeah.
Like dwelleth. So is it like a animal, or not necessarily speaking to a something that's personified, right? So it's not a human element or a deity, as it's this case. So if it's not a who, that's another way you can do that. But this is one of those questions that it comes at you fast, and like interrupting it is challenging anyways. Most quizzers would probably hit into the word Zion, like as the quizmaster is going into that z sound.
I would agree that it'd be hard to hit faster than getting a Z. That it's because it just hits you so quick. I would completely agree.
So not a whole lot else to say about this particular question, just because it is a type that you're going to come across of it's quick and it's fast, and you have to be on it and be ready. Well, a mistake quizzers might end up making is the question is read in its entirety, and then they feel like they interrupted even though they didn't.
Right.
And then are like, oh, I need to say more stuff, because I see that happen occasionally.
Right.
I see my own quizzers do that occasionally.
Right.
So that's something to be aware of.
I will say that, like, for the elite hitting level, it's you have to get a strategy for how you want to treat these quick 10-point questions where the first word is the question word.
Yes.
Because I know some people coach and say, in a 10-point question, if the first word is who or what or where, hit, because then you're going to get enough to figure it out. That you can get burned that way for sure.
Mm-hmm.
But what do you think about that? About if it's a question word hit?
I think I tend to coach my quizzers that you have to go with your instincts of, like, you need to pay close attention to the question, not just you hear a question word, so you hit.
Right.
I want quizzers who think through that process. And obviously everyone's going to have points where they hit a little too early or they make a mistake, whatever. That happens for everybody. That's the nature of the game. But this is one that if you were hitting super aggressive and you hit it like you heard that question word and you hit, you might get through part of the word dwelleth. And this is one that would burn you.
Or who dwelleth in, and even that's not
right.
That's not completely unique. At the material.
But if you heard the word who and then you hit, you would probably get who dwell, which is definitely not enough to go with. And so, like, it's a risk. You might pick the right one. You might not.
It also depends on how fast the quizmaster reads and who it is.
Correct.
And such. So.
Correct. And so that's a good thing to talk about that I don't necessarily think we talk about a whole lot. I do a lot of that work with my own quizzers in practice, that when we know who the quizmasters are going to be at tournaments we will go to, I tend to change how I read in practice. That if I know that, okay, let's say we're going to a tournament and the quizmaster is someone who stops immediately as soon as they hear someone buzzing in, and they don't, like, there's not finishing a word, they don't give anything else, they will stop like mid-breath. So that's something we'll work on in practice. But I know other quizmasters, like on the national level, I don't think either one of the experienced division quizmasters are like that. I think they have a tendency to give us a little bit of information.
I would agree. My daughter decided to join us for the podcast.
Hi.
So, you want to say hey? No? Oh, she's going to act shy. All right. So, yeah, I agree with everything you said.
All right, next question. I really like this one. The multitude in Acts chapter 2 described who as Galileans.
Ooh, see, this is one where my kids would probably hit too fast.
And hit at the multitude?
The multitude in Acts.
Or in Acts chapter 2, yeah. Yeah. I think that for a long time, the tens were set up to just like bang, 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 just like hit them, without necessarily thinking. And I think some writers, and Brother Faubert being one of them, have written in more conscious ways where you do have to be patient and you have to slow down, and not just hit completely based on the fact that I was told that I should hit when I hear a keyword, but
right.
Really listening and thinking through the question so you don't get burned. And we see that sometimes there are quizzes that are won and lost based on rereads in the tens.
Right.
It happens.
I will say that, and some quizzes are won in the tens.
Yes.
It's more rare, but I mean, definitely quizzes can almost be won, at least psychologically, in the tens. But I will say we struggled a lot more in the tens last year. I don't know if it was just last year, Brother Faubert, like you said, kind of decided to write less of those really quick, don't think 10-pointers, and added more ones like this one,
right,
where you have to be patient and there is a spot where you can hit it, but honestly it's pretty much at the end of the question.
Right. I mean, you could risky wise hit partway through described,
right,
but you're still taking a risk,
right, because then if you get the multitude in Acts chapter 2 described, you only have so many verses last year in Acts chapter 2, so that kind of limits the scope already. Right. And then it's the multitude describing somebody. So it is unique, but...
But also, I guess that goes to another point of there is some work that you need to do as a quizzer that's outside of just quoting and charting and referencing. And it's making sure you have an understanding of who's doing what.
Right.
And it's not just like words in your head, but you're taking the time to do some reading. I often will have my quizzers will read the year's material in the Amplified Classic, just because that tends to give us little better scope and understanding of who is the person that's doing these things. And this question in particular, and questions like it, I think are difficult for intermediate quizzers who are new to clarifying pronouns.
Right.
Because oftentimes a question like this, like where it says the multitude or whatever it might be, that's the clarification of a pronoun, and the actual group or person is mentioned earlier in the chapter.
Right.
And so the quizzer tends to they'll hit when they hear the multitude or whatever the word is, and they'll go right to that verse and try to make a question out of that verse. But you need to know then that person or that group of people, that entity does other things throughout the chapter, even if it's not necessarily in the verse in which they're mentioned.
Yep, I completely agree. So, and a lot of times, that is interesting. So, but a lot of times they use like referring to the multitude, but I feel like the referring to is only typically used when the pronoun is in the question.
Right.
Where the pronoun isn't in the question. In this one, it's just the multitude described who is Galatians.
Right.
So that maybe is another thing to kind of pay attention to when you're studying questions. I will say, shameless plug, that as far as understanding like who did what, new podcast out with Eric Forbes, really excited about it. We're having a series where we're breaking down scriptures chapter by chapter and really kind of slowly going through and talking about the poetry of it, talking about the pronouns, talking about interpretations. So we really want to have another resource for people to, for kids, especially for quizzers, to try and understand for it to be more than words and to really understand what is happening. So.
And there's lots of resources that you can, and I'm sure you'll talk about this with Eric, that there's lots of resources that you can go to and read and just like be able to deepen your understanding, commentaries, books, reading the material in other versions. There's lots of things you can do.
I agree. All right, what you got next?
All right, next. All right, another direct one. How does the Spirit make intercession for us? This is another one of those where at the beginning, like, you have that question word, and this is one that would be a burn as well, because some kids might hit it. How does? Okay, good luck.
Or if the quizmaster reads fast, like, how does the Spirit? You may get lucky, but hows are, to me, tough. I mean, it's tough to quizzers don't typically think, oh, that's a how when they're learning a verse or they're quoting a verse. It's more of something that
that we learn as we're being asked questions.
Exactly. Yeah. All right.
So probably don't need to talk about this one a whole lot. Other than that, it is another type of question. I would say, like, when I was quizzing, I don't feel like we had as many how questions in the tense. That we were asked much of the lower level question words, the who, the what, the whens, as opposed to the whys and the hows. And I think that in the last 5 to 6 years, more of those questions have been filtered into the tense.
Last year, when we were prepping for nationals, I pretty much told my kids in the tens, if you can make it a good how or a why, go with the how or the why. Like, it just seemed like that. In my opinion, Brother Faubert wanted to challenge kids with those tougher question words.
Right. Now, you have to understand as a quizzer when you're interrupting, and there are going to be questions where you could make a how question out of it, but you also have to think through in your head, how long is my answer?
Right.
If my answer is lengthy, it's not going to be a how in that 10-point question.
Yep.
So you have to really think through, like this one with groanings which cannot be uttered. That's really short. So that's why this question makes sense. But I also think this question was written with the quizzer in mind, because you could have written it differently, where you said the Spirit makes intercession for us how. But it was written this way so that the quizzer has the ability to interrupt without worrying about, is the question how or is it with what?
I completely agree. And I know that is, I have talked to Brother Faubert, and he says that is something he specifically tries to take out of the quizzer's hands as far as choosing and flipping prepositions, right?
Yep.
The in what, for whom, like in what and where is probably the most common, preposition flip. But yes, it is appreciated that he puts the how at the front.
Right.
So the quizzer.
Right, because we want to do things to the benefit of the kids.
Exactly. I agree.
All right. So this is another common question type that we'll see, like something is described as what, or is described how. The perfect place to hit here, in my opinion, is you kind of have to wait until you hear the verse reference of the Lord is described as what, two things in verse 14, or like hitting as the verse reference is coming out. So in verse 4, like at that point, that's when you're hitting, and most quizmasters, you're going to get the rest of that word out 14, and then you have to be well charted enough to know which verse 14 the Lord is in. But also something that I have my quizzers do is we have a regiment where the kids quote 3 different ways each week. So they'll quote in all the verses out of order. They'll quote all their one day. They'll quote their verses in order another day, and then they'll quote based on verse reference. So they'll quote all the verse 1s, and then all the verse 2s, and all the verse 3s, and so on. That helps with some of this, so that if you're in that situation, because no matter how well you've charted, you're going to have times where you just blank out. That's the nature of the human brain. So if you've worked really hard at that way of quoting on the quoting by verse number, that way you should really easily be able to quote, okay, there's this 14, that 14, there's 4 or however many verse 14s, and so you could quote through all of them very quickly.
Yes, and I will say last year was a little different because there were more unique verse numbers last year, in my opinion, because of doctrine, because it jumped around a lot.
Because of the yes.
Where this year there's a lot of like 1 through 8. So if you get like a 1 through 8, good luck. But if you get like a 22, then
or a 45 or whatever,
right, then it really limits it, and it really gives you an advantage. So I do like the recommendation to quote by verse number, though. It's really good.
Yep.
All right.
And that's something I learned from my last year of quizzing. I was quizzing with a different coach, or with a different church, and my coach that year from Appleton, Pete Larraball, he taught me to do that. So I've kind of carried that over to my kids.
Yeah, this is another one my kids would probably hit on. The Lord is described as. So, by the way.
Yep. Mine would too. So even no matter how much we work on it, like that's still going to happen. Yeah. So this is one of those questions that I feel like you could hit fairly early on, even though it's the verse is taken and moved. So like the verse like moved around a little bit, so that you're in the way you answer, it's not necessarily the way that the scripture is written, because it's one of those questions that gets toward understanding, like so that if you can move the information around and you can synthesize, that means that you truly understand what you've learned and that you're not just quoting verbatim. This is a question like Jesus went up straight out of the water when that kids coming straight out of juniors will struggle with, because they don't hear a lot of questions written in the way where they'll take the it's just written, questions are written in the flow of the verse,
right,
not necessarily moved around, and that's very common in seniors.
Yoda
so
speak.
These are the kinds of questions that junior kids coming right out of juniors should be doing a lot of work on.
Right. So I will say that and a lot of juniors also would probably say Jesus went up straightway, and if they hit there, out of what? The water.
Right.
Right? Mm-hmm. Like, but that, and maybe some senior quiz writers would write that question.
They might.
It's simple, it's direct. Jesus went up straightway out of what? The water. But this was something that when I was teaching my kids on Brother Faubert's state final set, he doesn't really like those very direct, easy peasy, just cheesy answers. He likes the whens and the hows and the whys and more of that. So you have to pay attention to see if it could be a when, if it could be a how, if it could be a why, and if like you said, the answer length fits.
So that's something that we'll do also, now that you bring that up, that I last year after state finals, when we were prepping for nationals, we went through, and for each type of question, directs, 2 parts, in the 10s, and then in the 20s the same way, and in the 30s, we tallied how many times we saw each question word. So we counted how many times did we see what's, how many times did we see when's, how many times did we see how's, that kind of thing. So because that can, like, visually seeing that there were a lot more like when, how, and why questions than you would have anticipated.
Interesting.
Particularly on directs. Now, 2 parts were a little different.
Right. We're going to get into some 2 parts.
Yeah.
Soon.
I think I'm on 2 parts in a second. I thought that was the last one, but it's not. Well, here's a why question, so we can just quickly talk about that. Like I had just mentioned, that in the past we hadn't seen tons of why questions in the 10s, and this is one of them. The angel of the Lord told Joseph that Mary shall bring forth a son, and thou shalt call his name Jesus. Why? This is one that, I think you could interrupt this fairly early. Now, some kids are going to hit at the angel of the Lord. Because they will. That some quizzers who primarily hit 10s are so trained that they have to hit very early that you'll see that happen. And this is one that it's long. Sometimes I think that quizzers on 10-point questions, when it just feels like it's longer, they just hit because
they feel like they're supposed
to. So many words have come out. I need to hit now.
Right. I agree.
So I don't know that we need to talk a whole lot more about this one.
That's a good example of just the one another that just the patient quizzer wins.
Yep. And that happens some years. I remember the last time we did Psalms in 2003 at nationals, the questions felt very, very different than they did at state finals. And the quizzers who thought they had it all figured out maybe didn't. And you saw teams that were a little more patient do very well. And interestingly, a lot of it was geographically, that at the time, the teams that tended to attend the South Central Extravaganza were very, very aggressive. And the teams that were attending the North Central Extravaganza were, not that they weren't aggressive, but were a little more picky about their spots. And so that year just happened to be that the trophy teams at nationals were primarily from the North Central and Western extravaganzas that year, which was just interesting. That hadn't happened in recent memory, so that was an interesting year.
So where do you think the spot is where this question? I would say probably on like shall bring, because at that point, knowing Brother Faubert, knowing that he likes his whys, you've definitely found where the rest of the question is going, and nothing else really makes sense. Shall bring forth what? A son. That's not really his thing. Shall bring forth and thou shalt call his name what? That doesn't really make sense either. Or thou shalt do what? Not really. It's really kind of like you have to kind of understand what he prefers to do, and in this case, that why being there and on the shorter side, that seems like that's the best option for Brother Faubert. But
I would agree.
I don't know if a lot of
you could ask that thou shalt call his name what question, but it seems like, okay, we had a lot of extra information that we didn't need to get to that.
I think every word put in the question was put there for a reason. So you have sometimes it's not there to make more words to make you wait. It's there to set up the question, right?
Exactly.
And I know a lot of times last year, I just had to say, like, he did that for a reason, so you can't ignore it. You have to figure out why that information is there. So I think this is a good example of that. All right,
moving on. I'm pretty sure we're on to the. Oh yes, we are. We're on to the 2 parts now.
Staying in the 10s, right?
We're staying in the 10s. Yes.
Okay.
So in this case, this 2-part, charity doth not behave how and is not provoked how. this is one of those questions that as a quizzer, you need to really pay close attention to the emphasis that the quizmaster puts on words. And that's where I will just have my own little shameless plug that all quizmasters should make sure that they're putting the emphasis on the right word, because that's really going to hurt the quizzer if you don't. Because if you said something like "Charity doth not behave how," then that completely changes the way that a quizzer is going to think the question should go.
Right. If the quizzer does understand the proper reasoning behind the inflections.
Mm-hmm. And this one follows a very clear pattern of, the how doesn't do something how, like doth not verb how is not verb how. So not verb how is the pattern here. And I think that as a quizzer, where I would instruct my quizzers to hit would be charity doth not behave, like partway through behave, right, is where we should be hitting.
Because if they feel that inflection coming, which usually you can tell the next word's about to be inflected. If you hit there, you get the inflected, emphasized word, and then you pretty much have the pattern set. So behave, that's the verb. That should tell you that the verb in the next part in the next question word, or the next half of the question, is going to change. Yeah. The verb is going to be the part that changes. Now, if it said charity doth not behave how,
right, then the question word is going to be what changes.
Right, and that's what they have to look for. But in this case, the verb is what they're going to have to look for the change, and that tells them that the question word most likely should stay the same.
Right. And if it doesn't, something is weird.
Well, and emphasis is so important, and to be written right, to be read right, but also I tell my kid that sometimes the lack of emphasis is something that you have to pay attention to as well, because that usually, then if you don't have any emphasis, that usually can tell you maybe it's a 3-part question that's a what, who, and a where it's all different. And so they're trying to tell you there's not going to be a blatant pattern. It's going to be different. So emphasis is important. Non-emphasis is important as well.
All right. So, and this is one of those questions that that there isn't necessarily a pattern that's discernible as far as like following the question word. But this one is according to Acts chapter 11. When they heard these things, they held what and glorified whom? Quizzers tend to, and this is one of those questions where I see quizzers make mistakes as far as like they'll ask did what questions. Which is not, like, I've seen quizzers answer this question and say something like they did what to who.
Yeah, that
So the emphasis here is on that question word, so the question word is going to be what's going to change.
Right.
They held what and glorified whom. So I think you could, the safe place to hit here is that held what.
Right, but on a national higher elite level, it's probably not going to get there, right? It's probably going to get, according to Acts chapter 11, when they heard these things.
Right, and so then, and here's another thing that I will often tell quizzers. That's why you need, if you want to compete at the national level and you want to be able to hit where people do at nationals, and I mean, I overhear people who are newer to the quizzing scene, or just maybe haven't had trophy level success, and not that is everything, because it's most certainly not. I'll hear them like say like, how did they hit that there? Or like when you hear in the audience like people like when someone gets a question that it seems.
Oh, we lost you. Hold on, sorry, we paused a little bit. Sorry, you said let's start over to the point where you said when they hit when someone hits a question and they like are shocked.
And they gasp.
Yeah.
Okay. So there'll be occasions where when you're at nationals and like someone hits a question and it feels early and like everyone in the crowd is and it, sometimes I will sit there like, okay, it really wasn't as risky as you thought it was because I can tell that quizzer writes their own questions. Now, when you go to that verse and you've tried to write every kind of question that you can on that verse, and that quizzers should be doing that because that's helpful to them. That's what I did as a quizzer, and honestly, for me, I don't know that I necessarily was even all that talented as a quizzer. I just worked really hard and did a lot of question writing. So I was able to hit, not because I was naturally aggressive. I was not naturally aggressive. I don't know that I interrupted a question before seniors, if you want me to be honest with you.
Wow.
I think I quizzed 3 years in juniors and was only interrupting quotes. I don't think I was interrupting anything else. But then when I got to seniors, I had a coach who instructed me to do a lot of writing of questions, and that helped me get more aggressive. So if you have quizzers who are more cautious, that can be a help for them too, is having them write questions, because then they'll see like, oh, there's only this many questions that you can even ask from this one. So if I've written all the questions I can think of about this verse, I should be able to know which way to go based on the structure of the sentence.
I agree. And as writing questions for the last 2 years, I completely agree that most of my time last year and this year, I really felt like I knew where the question was going because I'd written it, or at least written something like it, similar on not all of them, but a lot of them I had written a similar question where I just feel like I just knew where the question was going, not even really being super familiar with the verses as much. And so I can definitely see how writing questions would probably be immensely helpful. I try to get my kids to do it, but it's hard to get when your kids are busy.
Yep. It's one of those things that like it's easier when you start early. And I always tell myself every year that like, oh, we're going to start early writing questions. And then extravaganza rolls around and we haven't done it yet. So, oops.
Yeah.
But yeah, that's a hard one to work in the time to do. You want to, and you have every intention to, but you know, kids would much rather sit and hit questions than sit and write questions.
I agree. All right. Let's what you got next?
All right. So this is another like following the pattern of your who's. And like I talked about earlier, in these the 2 parts in the tens, that's where you have more of the obvious questions. This one gives you a reference of in 1 Thessalonians chapter 3 verse 13 records that with who, and that's where you could hit there with who is who coming. The two, you have less of that, the whys and the hows in the 2-part questions, just because
I think
the
for
length
length purposes.
Yes,
right?
the length part of the answer of the how or the why or the when is long enough that it would become a 20-point question if you added in an additional
sometimes a
question
how,
of some kind.
sometimes a how, like we had one earlier that was how, but they were like 1-word answers, right?
Right.
And that's pretty rare.
It's occasional, but it's not often.
I agree.
All right, moving on. Okay. Another 2-part, verse 9 of 1 Timothy chapter 2 mentions what kind of apparel and what kind of array.
I like questions like this a lot.
Yes. And I do as well. The interesting thing to me is I feel like based on you've been given this reference, and that they have the emphasis on apparel and array. It's not going to get there. I think that it's a 2-part, and you've got your reference. As soon as you hear what kind, that's where you're headed.
Right, and then you had to. As soon as you hear what kind, you look for adjectives, right?
Yep, you're looking for adjectives in your verse. And And that one is what, in like manner also that women adorn themselves in modest apparel with shamefaced innocence, brided not with braided hair, gold or pearls across their way.
And that's a long verse.
Yes. And where quizzers might make a mistake on that one is that they would say like, what kind of hair?
Which is what, embroidered?
Embroidered, yeah.
Embroidered. That's what I meant. Sorry.
Just sewing things up in your hair. But this is one where I wouldn't go there, because you're looking more for like array, and apparel can in some cases be synonymous, right? Where you're talking about things that you're wearing,
right?
So
they pair up better.
There's a parallel with apparel, which sounds weird to say, but there's a parallel there between those two nouns of apparel and array. So that's where
you think this is the kind of question where you need to figure out the whole question before you can't just find the first question that you think it is and say it and then figure out the second one. They kind of need
you need to quote the whole verse in your head and not like be quoting part, because sometimes I'll see quizzers start quoting and they're like, oh, I know that I can say this word. Because if you're doing that as you're going, they're going to say what kind of apparel and what kind of hair.
They probably didn't even get to the end of the verse.
Because they didn't even get to the end of the verse. They just went to the first two adjectives.
Right. That is a good point. And that just shows that the level at which you know your material, you had to be able to, in 30 seconds, think through the verse, maybe once or twice, figure out what pairs best together with the adjectives, and then not only say it, but also answer it.
And I talk to my quizzers all the time about the word they hear from me all of the time is automaticity, that we need to have automaticity when we quote our material, that it should be automatic. You should not have to like think through every phrase when you're quoting. Like, you shouldn't have to sit there and think, how does this go? No, you need to be automatic.
Right.
And that, because that gives you time to actually think about the verse instead of having to think of the verse.
Right.
I want you to be able to think about the verse, not think of it.
Automaticity. My kids would probably make fun of me for saying that, and I probably will say it. So we're probably gonna
I think you should say it just to see what they do.
I probably will. I like that. Yeah, that's a good way to say it. It's a good way to explain it to them why it's important. But that is very true. That on a national level, especially, and hopefully, if you want to be quizzing your best at Extravaganza and those tournaments, it's right. It has to be. I say effortless. Usually, is what I say. You can't.
Yeah,
same thing. You have to. You can't be worried about the verse. You have to be worried about the question. And I know it's funny because in practice, and one time I had to tell a story on Darren Venus, but our kids get to a point, and what, especially certain kids, and you're like, okay, if they get the question right, they're going to answer it right because they know their material so well. There's no way they're not going to answer it right. And so in practice, a lot of times, we're reading questions and they hit, and if they answer it right, I just think you have to really check the answer because I know they're going to say it right. We had a tournament one time, and I was actually that Urbana tournament that I met you at, and it might have been against your team actually, where Avery hit the buzzer, interrupted, and Darren was the quizmaster, and Avery finished the question. And Darren said, that is correct. Question number 8. He just didn't even let him answer it. He just called him correct after he finished the question because he knew he was going to get it correct.
Right.
And it's funny because, when they're automatic, you know that there's no chance they're going to miss it because they literally can't mess up because they know it so well. That's what the goal is. Do we got any more 10s?
Nope.
Okay, so let's do this. I know this is maybe a little surprise, but I think we're going to make a couple videos. So we're going to do this is going to be a 10-pointer video.
Yeah.
And then we can do a 20-pointer and a 30-pointer. So thanks everybody for watching. We really hope that this video is going to help you just kind of have a deeper understanding of questions and question writing, question structure, and how to properly answer. So also, join us for the 20s and 30s because we're definitely going to keep diving in and keep going. So thanks.